Hello and welcome. In this lecture, this is a follow-up finishing the previous lecture, which was all about our appointment reminder application. The lecture was getting rather long, and Udemy is kind of frowns upon long lectures, so I cut it off after creating the user interfaces. In this lecture, we want to continue by implementing the Java source code. So just a little bit of a reminder here. If you remember, we have this appointment reminder application, keeps track of appointments by name type and date time. Has a couple activities. We implemented both the user interfaces for each activity. So we've done this part right here. Now we want to basically pick it up by implementing the Java source code. Essentially this point at step 3. We're going to create our appointment class in this lecture. This is just an object to store all the appointments in. We can go through this array list. They're going to be stored in an array list in our main activity. We can go through the array list and populate our table rows, which are dynamic. We're then going to start implementing the main activity, populating the dynamic table rows, and then starting the second activity. So we'll do a start activity for result, and the second screen will show. And then we'll start implementing that second activity, which includes adding member variables, giving the current date and time in the onCreate method, handle the onClick methods to show the date and time pickers when selecting the edit text, also handling the onClick methods after you've selected a date and a time, and then also creating dialogues, which is similar to step 3, handling the cancel button, handling the add appointment button to pass data back to the screen. And again, as always, testing each step, I've tried to reiterate and tried to emphasize that it's very, very important to work in small steps and constantly test your code after each step before moving on to the next step. It helps isolate your bugs. And then we'll complete the implementation of the main screen at the end, which includes handling the onActivity result, mainly populating the data that was sent from the second activity. In the first activity, we want to populate an array list and go through and add the table rows. And that's it. So the first lecture, the last lecture, was pretty tedious. We'll try to move quicker in upcoming lectures. I don't want to go through every single detail, but because it was our first real project where we were doing something that actually was more practical, I wanted to go through every little detail, and that including adding string resources, everything. So let's pick up where we left off right now and go to our application. Okay, so here's our application. As I mentioned, the first thing we want to do is we want to create a new class. This is the Java source code, so let's go to the main activity.java, which is in our Java source file. And we want to create a new class. You can create a new Java class by going new Java class. We're going to name this class, I think we'll just name it appointment since that's what it is. It's not going to be derived off any class, subclass, or interface, so we're just going to say OK. And what this class is going to do again is it's going to store all of the data for appointments. We then can store them in an array list, and it just makes our application a little bit more maintainable and just easier to use. So we're going to add some member variables. And because it's tedious typing, I don't want to type everything out and have the lecture go on forever. I'm going to be doing some copy and pasting. And I hope you understand why that is. It's again, for efficiency, not for anything other than that. We're going to explain the code as we copy and paste it. So here is where we're adding our member variables. And this object represents the data on the screen. It represents the name of the appointment, the type of the appointment, the month, the day, the year, the hour, the minute, and then AM or PM of the appointment. Right. This is all the data that we show in our table layout. In our table rows, we have name, type, and then we have fields for the date and fields for the time. And then the only other thing we're going to have in this class is a constructor, so that we can create new appointment objects in our main activity when we want to populate the array list. So our constructor is going to be rather large, and this is not always a good programming practice. When you have methods or constructors, you don't want to have them take a lot of parameters. Typically, if you've ever read a really good book, it's called Clean Code, which describes a lot of this. But this, you don't want to pass more than 4 parameters to a method. And this is a constructor. We know it's the constructor because it just has the name of the class. It doesn't have any return value. This constructor gets called when you create a new object, a new appointment object, and it passes in the appointment name, the the name, the type. We do have a little error here. This should be type. And it also passes in all the member data. And all we do in this constructor is we assign initialize member variables. And that's typically what you do in a Java constructor, initialize member variables. And this is our entire class. We could have getters and setters for this class, but we don't need them. We can just do it for the constructor. Now, what you'd really want to do is you'd probably want to not have so many, as I mentioned, parameters to the constructor, but it's okay for now. So now the next thing we want to do is we want to start implementing our main activity. And what this entails is populating our table rows dynamically. So we have one table row in our user interface. If you add table rows in the GUI editor, they'd have to be static. You'd have to know how many table rows you need ahead of time. We don't know how many table rows we need because we could be adding 10 appointments, 20 appointments, or 30. So what we have to do in the main activity is we have to create a new table row for each appointment that is added. For each appointment that's in the array list, which is where we're going to store our appointment objects. So we're going to have to create table rows dynamically in our source code. We're not going to be using XML. We're going to be creating them in our source code. So we want to go to our main activity, and the first thing we want to do is we just want to populate our table rows with some default data to make sure everything's working. We can take that out. So I'm going to create a helper method here called create some test appointments to start with. And this is going to be called in the onCreate. Like I said, it's just going to add some new table rows, and I want to do this in a nice cohesive manner. So I'm going to add a method. So I'm going to create this method, and we can do that. This is just going to be populating the array list, and then it's going to call a method to create the dynamic table rows. Again, I'm trying to create many methods to make it easier to maintain. So what we're going to do here is we're going to just create some new objects in our array list. And before we do that, we should create the array list. So let's create the array list first. So I'm going to add a member variable for our array list. It's going to contain appointment objects. Let's make this a little bigger so we can see. Right inside our main activity, we're just going to create an array list of appointments. Pretty basic there. Now, in our create some appointments to start with, we're going to populate that array list with just some default data. Again, mainly for testing to make sure everything is going good. So let's do that. So here, I'm adding some new appointments to my array list. I'm creating an inner anonymous object here, new appointment, and I'm just passing in some names, types, and some dates. So you can see here, new appointment objects, doctor's visit, setting the month, the day, the year, and then the time values as well. So just created a bunch of objects. Now for each one of these objects, I want to add a new table row. So I'm going to create another helper method that will add new table rows to our graphical user interface. So I'm going to call that method populate table. I need to call that for every object in the array list. So I'm going to do something like this. I'm going to go through my array list until the end of it, and I'm going to call populate table on each object. So now I have to create a populate table method. And then in here, I'll need to create new rows and add each view, which is a table row, to the layout. So first thing I want to do is I want to get my table layout, my resource for my table layout. So here I'm going to, on line 38, I'm going to call the find view by ID method and get my table layout name, which had an ID. I'm going to create a new table row, which is on line 40. And I'm going to also create some table row layout params. These are so everything is formatted correctly, because each table row has to have layout params, whether it matches the parent. So I create new table row layout params for wrapping the content and matching the parent, again for format. Now then I call in my new table row that I created in line 40. I pass in those layout params. Again, this is for formatting. So I created my layout. I added layout params to my new table row. Now I want to set up the data that's going to be added to the row. So what's in each of my table rows? I have 3 text views. So I have to create 3 text view objects. Here's my first text view object. It's a new text view that has the layout params I already mentioned. It also sets the gravity. It sets some attributes. We want to make sure its text is centered. We want to set the text to the array list counter, and the array list counter is actually passed in to the popular table. I just have to name it. And remember, our array list was a member variable, so we don't need to pass it in. We can access it. So here I'm setting my text name in my table row. I'm setting the gravity. I'm setting the appointment array list object in there, getting the name from it, because remember, that's an appointment object. I can just say .name. And then I can also set the width and set the text size and set the text alignment to be center. Now, another thing I'm doing here that's not great practice is I'm accessing the name variable directly because it's public. Really what I should be doing, and again, just because I did this only because I didn't want the lecture to run 2 hours, but I should have had a private data member variable and called the get and set method on it. So now we need to create our other 2 text fields. So here we're creating our TV type, and this TV type is just going to use the same layout parameters, center the gravity, get the object type, and set the width and text size, and the same for the alignment. And then the TV date is going to call a helper method set to date and time. So we'll have to add this helper method. This is just a helper method for formatting. This will just get the current date and time and just do a little formatting. So let's add that. So this set to date and time is just getting the current date and then formatting some data. This is a helper method. And the other thing it does is, if you'll notice on line 48, if the date in the object is the current date, it's not going to show the month and the day. It's going to show the time. So that's how we determine whether or not we show future dates in our main activity or whether we show time. It makes more sense if it's the current day, you don't want to see the date, you want to see the time. So now that we added our 2 text fields, all we have to do is add our row to the view. So we can just do that by doing the following. On our table row, we can add the view. Add our text view for name, our text view for type, and our text view for date. And then after we added those views to the row, we then can add the new row to the table layout. And one thing you'll notice here is the table layout on line 89, it's adding it array counter +1 because it's adding it below the one that we created in the GUI, mainly because we want to keep the formatting of that table row, and you won't see a difference. So let's compile and run this and see what it looks like. What should happen is the screen should come up with some default data in it, and just to know that we added our tables correctly, and then we can reuse this method when we add real data. So we've modularized everything so that it's going to work nice when we get the data from the second activity. So now when it comes up, it says doctor's visit, and it says all of our appointments, and it's nicely formatted. It's coming off the screen a little there with meeting, which we could easily correct by just moving over. The add appointment button's a little low as well. Okay, so now the next step is to go ahead and create the next activity. Actually, the one thing we need to do is in our add appointment button is we need to start that new activity so when we click the button, we want to start the activity, the second activity. So here we want to call start activity for result because we want to get a result back from the second activity, right? The add appointment activity is going to send us back any appointments that are added, and we're going to add them to the array list. So eventually we're going to have to come back to this class and we're going to have to implement on activity result. But for now we're good. We want to kind of implement this in a certain step-by-step manner and certain flows that make sense. So now let's go to the add appointment activity and start implementing some of this. So the first thing we want to do in this activity is we want to add some member variables, mainly member variables for our dialogue numbers and some of our fields in our appointment. So here we added some member variables starting line 10. We added 2 text views for the date and the time. We added some variables that we can store, where we can store our date and time information. So when we bring up each dialogue, our date and time pickers, we want to save that data, and we're saving them in the variables from line 13 to 18. In lines 20 and 21, these are IDs for our dialogues, 998, 999. Just pick those arbitrarily. First thing we want to do is when we come up on the screen, we want to set the current date and time. This is going to make it easier to select in the date, time, and picker. So we're going to add a little method called set current date and time when we come up. And we've done this in a previous lecture. We just get the current date and time and set it in the edit text fields. So here's our helper. Set current date on view, during current date and time on view. We get our two edit text values, our date and time. We get our calendar object, and we get the current date and the current time, and then we just call set text methods to set those widgets. So on line 47 and 51, here's where we're going to set the time and the date. We also have a helper method for the pad method. We also used this in a previous lecture. It just helps with formatting. So we're going to add this pad method at the bottom because it is a helper method. Okay, so that's a pretty easy method. We start up the application, we set the current date and time. The next thing we want to implement is when we select the edit text fields for date and time, we want to bring up the correct dialog. So we want to add 2 on clicks for each edit text. It's kind of weird. Usually we've added on clicks to buttons. It's a little bit more intuitive. You click a button, an event happens. You can still click on an edit text. When you click on an edit text, you can also have an action such as bringing up a dialog. So here we're going to add our handlers, edit text time and edit text date. And all that's going to do is it's going to call show dialog with our IDs for showing the dialog. Now in order to show the dialog, we have to override the onCreateDialog method to show a picker, either a date or a time. So here we have to call our onCreateDialog, and in our onCreateDialog, we check the ID on line 64 and 67 in a switch statement. Depending if it's a date or a time dialog, we create the right picker. We also add in a listener. We have to add listeners for our date and time so that when the user decides what the time and date they want to pick, a method gets invoked. So that's why these are red, because we haven't added our listeners yet. But this is pretty straightforward, right? We just create our new date and time pickers. And so now we have to add our on-event handlers for each the date picker and the time picker. So now we add our date picker, on date set listener. This gets called when after the date picker comes up and we select our date, this will get called. And all we do is we save our year, month, and day to our member variables because we need to pass them back to the main activity. And we set the text for our edit text field. And that's the date. And then here we do the same for the time picker. So here on the on time set picker, we just we set the time and we override the on time set as opposed to the on date set, set our member variables, and then set our edit text field. So this would be a good time to test and just kind of see what's going on. We haven't actually sent anything back to the main activity, but we can see what's going on here. So let's build and run. Make sure we have no errors. We built successful. At this point, when we run the app, the main should come up with default data, the main activity. We should be able to select the button to go to the second activity. So we have add appointment. We added that. This calls start activity for result, and our second screen comes up. And our second screen looks pretty good. We haven't implemented the cancel button. We haven't implemented the add appointment button, but we have implemented the date pickers and the time pickers. So now we can enter a name. We don't do anything yet. We can see if the spinner works. The spinner looks good. We can select other. That gets set appropriately. And now when we select our edit text, we should have a picker come up. So if we select the time, we should have a picker come up, and we do. So this is bringing up the date picker. And you can select your date picker and just say OK. And that will set the edit text field to whatever I selected, because that's the listener. When I select the time, it will bring up the time picker. And whatever I set in here after I hit OK, it will call the listener and set the text field. And it did, 1820. But the cancel and the add appointment aren't doing anything. In fact, the cancel crashed because we added something, but we didn't do anything in it. So now let's move on to our next step. The next step is implementing the cancel and the add appointment. The cancel is pretty easy because the cancel is not going to do anything other than just finish. It's just going to go back to the first screen. It's not going to add any data. It's just going to be done. So the cancel is pretty easy. We can just call the finish method. And that's it. Now for the adding the appointment, we have to create our intent and add all the data to it. And so that requires a little bit more code, but we know how to do that from previous lectures. We can create an intent object and use the put extra method to populate the data. So here is our new method on line 127. This is the event handler for selecting the button. First thing we need to do is we need to get the values for our edit text. We have to get the name of the appointment. We also have to get the values for the spinner. So we get our resources for each. We then check to see if the name is not empty. If the name is empty, we're going to show a message that says, please enter an appointment name. If it's not empty, we're then going to create our intent and start filling it in with data. First thing we're going to do is the name is going to be the edit text.getText2string, whatever the user typed in. The type on line 135 is going to get it from the spinner. We can get the item from the spinner by just calling getSelectedItem and then converting it to a string. The month, day, year, hour, minute, and AM are going to use the member variables. But we want to make sure it's in the correct format. So I created some helper methods here called display the month in characters, format the hour, and AM or PM. So let's add those helper methods down at the bottom of the class. So I created a bunch of helper methods for formatting. Display the month in characters, we get a certain number back from the date picker. And we don't want to just show a number. It's better to show the actual text for the month. So I just wrote a quick switch statement. Depending what the number is, I converted it to text. Pretty straightforward. To format the hour that comes back from the time picker is 24-hour clock. We could set that property of that to not do that. But since we didn't, if it's greater than 12, we want to set the correct hour by just minusing and equaling. And then we also want to set AM or PM just so it's easier for the user to understand what the time is for their appointment. So now we've pretty much got this entire class done. When we select the button Add Appointment, after putting all the data in the intent, we call Set Result and we call Finish. And this is going to go back to the main activity, and the main activity now has to implement the handling of that data, basically to call the populate table method. So let's save this. Let's go back to our last implementation for the main activity, which is handling the onActivityResult method. And in doing that, it entails the following. So we're in our main activity. We want to implement the onActivityResult. This is an override method. This gets called when the code from the add appointment activity calls finish. Remember, the add appointment activity is sending data back so that we can populate it in our table layout. So here on activity result, this is straightforward format. We have a request code, a result code, and we call super. We make sure the request code is good, that it's coming back from the right activity, which was just 1. We hard coded that. Then we make sure that the result is okay, and if it is, all we have to do is add a new appointment to the array list. We just populate our object and add it to the array list, and then we can call our method populate table. Because before, when we created the default data, we modularized it. We created methods. So now it's really easy to implement the onActivityResult. We can reuse our code. This is software reuse. It's a very important concept with programming. We don't have to duplicate code here. We can call our helper method populate table, and everything's good. Remember, the populate table creates the new table rows and adds the data to the table layout. And so now that we got new data, we have to add that new row. And this is what that's doing. So now our application is done. Now we just need to test it more. And we should have been testing it as we were going. But again, for efficiency reasons, we didn't. But this onActivityResult is pretty easy. So let's compile this and run it and see how our application works. We should have full functionality at this point. Everything should work. So we're going to bring up our main activity. It's going to have some default data in it. When we hit the add appointment, if we don't enter a name and we try to add the appointment, it's going to have a text box or a toast message come up to say, please enter a name. So let's see if that works. Please enter an appointment name. You cannot add a new appointment if it doesn't have a name. It's sort of like the primary key. You need to have it. If we hit cancel, nothing happens. We just go back to the main activity and no data is added to the table layout. So there, because we just call finish. Now if we call add appointment and we add some real data, let's add Jason. Let's just add a new task for work. These don't have great names. Let's create a new date. We'll do something in the future. Say okay, April 30th. Get rid of the keyboard. Create a new time. Some minutes. Hit OK. And then add appointment. And we should see this new activity in our table. So when we call it, we see Jason. It's there. You just notice that it's showing the date and not the time because the date is in the future. Let's add an appointment that is current. For example, today. We'll keep the date the same. Now we'll just add a new time saying we don't have much time. But let's say 11. Say OK. And now we add the appointment when we select OK in our time picker. So now we have our current time. Now when we add the appointment, when we go back to the main activity, we should see the time displayed. We do 11:55. We'll also probably want to test our scroll bar here. So we could just add a bunch really quick. Yeah, that might take a while, but our scroll view will work. We could populate it with more data. We could do that with the default data in our code by just creating more, populating with more default data. So if I wanted to copy this, there'll be some duplicate tasks, but we could just test the scroll view this way. So now when it comes up, hopefully you'll see the scroll view working. See, the scroll view works. And the add appointment's not included in the scroll view. So here's our first Earl app. I hope you had some fun writing it, and I hope you learned a lot from it. It demonstrated a lot of concepts that we've covered, mainly creating graphic user interface controls, handling events, using the date and time picker, also doing things like adding different attributes, using string resources, a lot of the concepts that we've learned so far. I also want to remind you that the source code for this has been uploaded, so it should be right under the lecture, under your resources. You can see the zip file there, and you can play around with the source code. Thanks for listening, and I hope you learned a lot.